Hey guys, I'm Lorena, and thanks for checking out this message today. We're so glad that you're here, and we want to connect with you and your family. So please text River Connect to 97,000, and you can also visit our website at theriverchurch.cc to learn more about us and all the upcoming events we have. And lastly, if you want to give to the River Church today, you can text the amount you want to give to 84321, or you can head to our website and click the Give tab at the top of the page. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope that you enjoy today's message.
I remember there were a few of us talking to Pastor Josh Combs about the title of the book. And we came up with this Why God. And it's interesting with the punctuation for it, because I think you can go why, comma, God, question mark, and you're asking, like, God, why is this happening? And that's a fair thing to happen, right? And I know a number of you, your story is a little part of them that would ask that question. But I also think it can be why, question mark, God, exclamation point. Because God is very involved in our lives. We're going to be going through a 4-week series. This week I'm going to be talking about, or I'm going to try to talk about, God is in complete control. This is a great time because I'm going to be speaking lower and you guys will raise this up, which I like because less of me and more of him would be a good thing right now, right? Always a good thing. But this week will be God is in complete control. Next week, all things exist for God's glory. The third week, God's ways are not our ways. And then week 4, God loves you. And it's 4 truths to be thinking about when we're going through those times in life where it's, why is this happening, God? What's going on? I've been going through the Psalms of recent, on just my personal time, devotional time, and it's amazing on how real David is with God and how real David expects God to be with him. And just having that conversation of, God, are you missing something here? Asaph in Psalm 73, when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, my foot almost slipped. And then he goes down later to say, but when I came to the congregation, I realized what God was doing. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. In the book, the daily devotions, you can get emailed to you. You can go ahead and, we have the physical copies, but if you prefer digital copy, you can get that from our website or app for free. So if you like the digital copy, and then read through it. And I believe there's also an audio edition. I don't know. Probably check our website for the audio edition. That's our first book that has an audio aspect to it. As you're going through the book, for God being in complete control, he's going to talk about the life of Job. And he's going to start there. He'll reference Joseph in the Old Testament. And as we look back at those stories, we realize that God is in complete control. I want to try something different, and of course, on a day that I don't have my voice, I'm going to try something more. I want to go through the whole book of Esther today. So if you want to grab Esther on your app, if you want to grab the Bible from the chair right in front of you, it's page 364. There are 10 chapters, so you're going to have to listen quickly, if that makes sense. I've said that before, haven't I? Because I'm going to fly through this. But I really want you to capture the book of Esther. The first point I really want to emphasize with this is the reminder that there's God at work in our life when we don't even see him. And he's working around us, we don't see him. We haven't even requested something. We didn't even know we were going to have an issue, and he's already working our life. Something some of you may already know about the book of Esther. First of all, it's not a parable or just a made-up story. It's a historical event that is still celebrated today. And so now I'll get into that in a moment. But it's a very unique book because it's the only book in the Bible that God is never mentioned. The Lord is never mentioned. But as we go through the book together, I think you're going to see God very involved. And then I want us to transfer over to our own lives today. So here we go. Chapter 1, page 364, if you're grabbing the book in front of you there, the Bible in front of you. The first one just says, now in the days of Ahasuerus. That's a neat thing because you can always go back in history and culture and see that time. And we'll know of Nebuchadnezzar with the golden head, and then the silver, the Medes and the Persians, and we're getting into that time here. But in verse 4, he has an open house, and it says, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days, 6 months, half a year, he has, oh, that's right, also the verses will be up here, so thank you, Neva, for doing all of that. But for 6 months, he's having people come in and see all of what he has. Then he decides to have a feast for 7 days. When I get to verse 7, it says, drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And if you read in verse 8 on your own, it says, as each man desired. For 7 days, they drank as much as they wanted. Verse 9, Queen Vashti is another person for us, also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, and I would finish that phrase by saying, no good thing can happen. Right? After 7 days of drinking, no good thing's going to happen. Because verse 11, it says, bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. He wants to show off his trophy wife. Verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused, and the king became enraged. Do I have any VeggieTale fans here, by the way? Please, is anybody already thinking VeggieTales as we're going through this? She refused to make him a sandwich. Isn't that what it was? And so, but just, okay, I digress. Verse 13, he consults his wise men. What should be done? And in verse 17, they say, we have a major problem here. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Since they will say, Queen Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. What is this going to do to every other household? The king says to the queen, you need to do this. She says, no. And he's like, oh. So now other men will say, well, no. And what will they do? So the punishment, verse 19, Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. For those who know how the story is going to continue on, you pause right here and you say, God is in complete control. God is in complete control because even in this circumstance, it's going to open up the door for something else. Let's go chapter 2, verse 2. Let beautiful young virgins be brought out to the king. It's going to be a beauty pageant like no other. In verse 3, it talks about cosmetics being given to them. Verse 4, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. That's the prize. You become the queen. Verse 5, we're introduced to a guy named Mordecai. He's a Jew, Mordecai. In verse 6, we find out that he had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away from Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. I'll pause here for a moment. Captivity, in my mind, would be a horrible thing. Taking off into another area. And you could say real quickly, God, are you in control? God, do you care? God, are you involved? And as we go through, we're seeing that God's preparing for the future. Verse 7, he was bringing up Hadassah. Say that word, just Hadassah. Isn't that a fun name? It's Esther. But her Jewish name is Hadassah. That is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. So I think that makes him his cousin. Am I making sense there? Okay. She had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. I don't want to read into this passage what's not there, but I wonder how they died. Was it coming from captivity? Was it being taken? Do they fight it? We know back from Daniel taking out the best. And were they fighting to keep their daughter? I don't know those things, but she doesn't have her parents there, so Mordecai is raising her. So Hadassah, or Esther, enlists in this beauty pageant and finds favor in the eyes of Hegai, who was in charge. And in verse 10, Esther had not made known her people or kindred, which makes sense. You're in this pageant. Don't let them know that you're in for captivity, that you're a foreigner, that you're the slave girl. So she stays quiet about it. Verse 12, it tells us there's a 12-month process. Verse 15, now Esther was winning favor in all the eyes who saw her. In verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in the sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Winner, winner? Chicken dinner, right? Okay, so in verse 18, they have Esther's feast. I love how they celebrated Esther's feast. Remission of taxes, and gave gifts with royal generosity. That's an interesting phrase, isn't it? And so he gives gifts for others. Please constantly think through of this. God is in complete control. Because when we transfer to our own lives, I want us to realize this. A horrible thing happens, but God's in control and places her as queen. In verses 19 through 23, I'm still in chapter 2, we have like a parenthesis. In verse 21, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So Mordecai tells Esther, who tells the king on behalf of Mordecai. And in verse 23, when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So it's found to be true for those who only one other time. VeggieTales, aren't they banished to the land of perpetual tickling? Okay, never mind. Didn't mean to speak over your head by going VeggieTales, okay? So let's go back down. But let's go to chapter 3, okay? Chapter 3, verse 1. We have a new guy come on the scene. His name is Haman. So King Ahasuerus promotes Haman. And in verse 2, and all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai, again, the Jew, did not bow down or pay homage. He's not going to bow down to a man, only to God. And so you have Haman coming through, and whenever he comes in, people bow down to him. It's that kind of person who's like, enough about me. What do you think about me? Stop. It's all about Haman and his major pride issue. Haman finds out that Mordecai is a Jew. He's furious that Mordecai will not bow down to him. So in verse 6, he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, that he was Jewish, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So then Haman goes to the king, and he says, we have this group of people among us who have their own rules, and they don't obey your rules. Now, did they have their own rules? Yeah, they had the law, the 10 Commandments. But were they not obeying his? That wouldn't be a fair statement. But he says, I'll tell you what, I will get rid of the problem for you, and I'll pay you to allow me to do that. And so he offers 10,000 talents of silver. For the king, it's a no-brainer. There's a problem. You'll take care of it for me, and you'll pay me. Okay, that's a win-win, I would think, for in his mind, not knowing what's happening. So in verse 13, letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. They've gone from captivity, now the threat of death. He picked the date by like a roll of dice. It's called the PUR, the PUR. And that'll be something good to know for later in the story. But that's how he picked the date. So the date is specifically set for a time later on. You have to wonder, God, are you in complete control? It looks like things are going well. And then everything falls apart. Chapter 4. Mordecai learns what's being done. And so he throws on sackcloth and ashes. The Jews are mourning and fasting and weeping and lamenting with sackcloth and ashes. I'm in chapter 4, that's verse 3. Esther sends clothes to Mordecai. I don't think she wants him at the gates in sackcloth and ashes and that kind of thing. It could get him in trouble, actually. And then there's a guy named Hathach, and he becomes the go-between, the mediator between Mordecai and Esther, because she's in the palace and he's outside by the gates. And so the conversation between the two goes on. And so Mordecai tells Esther that she has to go to the king. You have to tell the king what's going on. And in verse 11, she says it's against the law for somebody just to show up before the king. And if they're not received, they could actually be killed. And then in verses 13 and 14, and if you're using one of the Bibles here, this is a great time to take out your phone and take a picture of this passage, okay? Because verses 13 and 14, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. He says, God has promised that the Jews will never be wiped out. We can trust God, but realize if you stay quiet, that doesn't spare your life. You and your family will all die by being Jewish. And then catch the last part of that phrase. I'm in verses 13 and 14 still. And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. For such a time as this. He's saying, you realize, he's kind of like taking her through a history with just one phrase, just implied, that your queen, Jewish, to maybe take a stand for a time like this. She says, hold a fast for 3 days and nights, and then I will go to the king. You know, at such a time as this, please pause for a moment in your own life. Evaluate what you're going through, the good and the bad, the places you're at, neighborhood, work, people you regularly are around. Why is it going on? Please give it over to God. For such a time as this, He's placed you there. He's not left you. He'll never leave you nor forsake you. He's with you for a reason. Question, how can I make a difference for Him? So Esther says, hold a fast for 3 days and nights, and then she'll go to the king. And in verse 16, she's very bold, and she says, and if I perish, I perish. She's willing to die for the cause. I mentioned earlier that God is at work even when we don't see Him. But I think we're now a turn in the book because they're looking to Him. God's not mentioned. The Lord's not mentioned. But by having a fast and prayer, it implies they're going to God. The Jewish people would go to the God Almighty and saying to Him. And so now they're going to see Him involved as they look to Him. Chapter 5, verse 2. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she found favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. He welcomes her. She comes to that area. He welcomes her in. He asks what her request is. And Esther said in verse 4, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast I prepared for the king. In verse 6, at the feast, the king says, what's your request? Whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. I'll give you half the kingdom. What do you want? And she says, how about the three of us do this again tomorrow? I can understand her being a little nervous. I'm not sure why, but she wants to wait. But we know from the story, God's timing involved. Verse 9, and Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. He sees Mordecai. Life is so good. Matter of fact, in verse 11, Haman goes on to explain, he remembers his riches, his sons, his promotions, and the special treatment he received from the queen. But he's caught up in bitterness. And he can't accept all of that. Again, let's pause in our own lives. Is there any bitterness consuming us? Do we need to give it over to God and let Him do something mighty in it? In verse 13, Haman says, yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. My riches mean nothing. My sons mean nothing. My promotions mean nothing because one guy won't bow down to me. Might have a problem. Might have an ego problem. So he builds a gallows 50 cubits tall, which is 75 feet. He wants to hang Mordecai. In my notes I put down, God in complete control? Question mark? Because as you're going through the story at this time, if you don't know the story, you could wonder, what's happening here? Chapter 6. The second half of the book will go a little faster, please. Thank you. Verse 1, on that night the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorial deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. He brings out a scrapbook. And I'll tell you, I heard of someone getting saved because they were reading the Old Testament, and they said, normally when it comes to history books, a country or nation only records their victories. But Israel records so many defeats. Why would you put those there? But most nations only put their victories. And so he brings out this book all about me. And so he has it read. The story comes about Mordecai revealing the plot to the king. Verse 3, the king asked, how was Mordecai honored? They say, well, nothing. Verse 4, Haman shows up. Now, please capture the time frame again. At night, the king couldn't sleep, so he had to be read to him, right? So he could sleep. Haman has the gall to think he deserves to go to the king's bedroom at night and knock on the door to talk to the king. That just baffles me. Verse 6, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And so Haman says, well, I guess, but the person, right, would like royal robes and a king's horse and a royal crown and dressed by an official and led through the city. And in verse 10, again, chapter 6, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse and all you've said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Yeah, God's in complete control. God's in complete control. If it's a perfect story, if you want to teach the golden rule, to do unto others what you want done unto you, but I don't think Haman had that in mind when he came to this part. Chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. In verse 2, the king asked, what is your wish, Queen Esther, up to half the kingdom again? In verses 3 and 4, then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. And I think as she's saying this, she has the king's full attention. It appears that he adores her. For him to welcome her into, and I know it's a God thing also, God blessing, but as he comes in, and then she's having dinner, and can we do dinner again tomorrow? Yes, we can. And it's like, he's excited about it. So she's talking about what's going on. What is it you would like? Just tell me what you'd like. And she's going through it. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I'd have been silent. But our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Interesting. She realizes if the Jewish people are eliminated, it's going to be a loss to the king. And the king replies immediately, who is this? In verse 6, and Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So the king is furious and walks out of the room. And Haman pleads with Esther, which makes me think again, the perception of what the king's response, of how he was listening to Esther. Haman realized that. So when he walks out, he's like, oh, I'm in trouble. And he pleads with Esther. Verse 8 can be a little humorous on what happens here with it. But, and the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? I'm not sure which way this is. You could take this either way. I don't know if it looked like Haman, as he's falling on the couch, falling on her, looked like a romantic gesture in front of the king, or of a violent one. He's trying to kill all my people. Is he now trying to kill my wife right now in front of me? But he says in the end of verse 8, as the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. That's like poetry, right? They covered his face. The words covered. You just see the expression of Haman as he trips and falls on her and then sees the king. Like, really? Even now? You're in front of me? He's like, oh, no. How do you explain this, right? This is a great place in your notes to put God is in complete control. Yes? Verse 9. Then Harbona. I like to, if I'm drawing this scene, I can only do it in my mind because my hand won't do it. But I have this nerdy guy off to the side, Harbona. And I have him as, he's a servant for the king. And he's off to the side. I think, I'm reading into this, so I'm not dogmatic about this. I think Haman has been cruel to him and every other servant around him. If he's expecting the normal people, the other officials to bow down to him, what's he expecting from the servants? And so I think Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, King, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that, and Haman was killed. Let's go to chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. And on that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. And now, in verse 3, you're going to have our problem's still not taken care of, because this date is set to destroy all the Jews. And so she brings it up for the king to cancel that date. And he says he legally can't do that. And so verse 11, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed force of any people of providence that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. Basically what he does here is he says, here's the date, be prepared for it. You're going to have a day of defense, and then you'll have a day of offense. You'll have a day where you can defend yourself, and then a day where you can strike out. So the Jews are ready for the date. Verse 15, Mordecai is in royal robes and great golden crown. Verse 17, in every province and every city, wherever the king's command and the edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews for fear the Jews had fallen on them. I start wondering, are people declaring themselves Jews to be associated with them in fear of what will be done to them? But I think it could also be the situation they've realized how the God of the Jews was involved in their lives. and protected them and what he's doing. And a reminder, when people see God involved in our lives, it opens up the opportunity to point them to God, not how good we are, how awesome he is. Chapter 9, verse 1, the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. Verse 4, for Mordecai was great in the king's house. His fame spread throughout the provinces, and the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. So I mentioned already about the defense, offense, verse 22, and as the days of which the Jews got relieved from their enemies, and as the month that it had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. It's so cool. It's a celebration to do something for others. I have a friend named Pastor Ty, and every year on his birthday, he gets gifts for some dear friends of thanking the kid, because he views his gift as their friendship. And so he reaches out, so he kind of reverses the cycle. It's kind of a cool thing. But God in complete control here. I mentioned P-U-R earlier, that casting of lots, the rolling of the dice. It's now because of that, the Jews have a feast that's called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. It was celebrated this year, March 23rd and 24th, and so it's still celebrated by exchanging gifts of food and drink, giving to the poor, eating a celebratory meal, and reading out loud the book of Esther, which I basically just did. But that's how it's celebrated every year. Chapter 10, verse 3. Think of this for those of you who are in leadership. And you're in leadership if you influence others. So I'm talking to a bunch of leaders here, right? But check the description from him here. For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. He was great among the Jews and popular with multitudes of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. That's what leadership should be. You take care of your people, right? You seek for peace. What a beautiful book for God being complete control. I know I could have just done a summary for you, but I don't think you would have appreciated it as much as going through the book for yourself. I encourage you to read through it this week. Read this God is in complete control chapter in the Why God book. But to think through it again of God being in control, let's grab some key phrases. The king has a celebration. He has a party. He calls for the queen, she refuses. If he doesn't call for the queen, if she doesn't refuse, a lot of things changes in this book. The queen, the new queen, Esther, happens to be in the area because of captivity, a horrible thing. She's in the area. Her cousin encourages her. She gets special treatment. She wins. Mordecai happens to be at the gate, happens to overhear a story about the king being killed, gets the word to them. They happen to find out it's true and to deal with it. Haman's exalted. Mordecai refuses to bow down. And I really think this is a big one. Haman happens to notice that one person didn't bow down. I can't imagine going through and people bowing down, for starters. And then secondly, to just like, oh, that one person's not doing it. He happens to realize it. But his pride brings his demise, right? He puts a plot to kill the Jews. We had that statement, for such a time as this. Esther's welcomed by the king, any wish. The king can't sleep. So he reads the contract. He can't sleep that night. Imagine that. You think that might be God's timing? Let's have a book read to me this time. Let's go to the story that must not have been read yet, or else he would have already honored him. Let's have Haman have an ego thing going on again and come to the king's room at just the time he's going to honor. Haman has to honor Mordecai. The gallows are made. Esther reveals Haman. The king sides with Esther, not Haman. That's an interesting one to me. The king walks in as Haman is on the Esther. I actually wonder if an angel tripped Haman. And he fell on. I feel God's that involved. God is in such complete control that he could have had that happen. Mordecai exalted, the edict modified, the Jews are saved and blessed, and Purim is instituted. What's your story? What are you going through? Where does this relate for you? Where is it where you need to realize that God's in complete control in your life? Is it your health? Like, why? Why, God, have you put me up for 9 months, right? Is it someone else's health that you're burdened for? And just asking, why, God? Why is this going on? Is it death? Someone passing and wondering, why did it have to go that way? Is it a relationship that's going bad or a relationship that's going nowhere? Is it work? Not being appreciated at work? Can't find the right job? For students with school, sports, extracurricular activities, I think with sports with injuries, and just thinking of, and I know, unfortunately for some adults, they get a mindset of, oh, you're a kid, you'll get over it. Those are huge times, and I know the people we have working with the children's ministry and the student ministry, kids ministry and student ministry, they're passionate about them and realizing that what they're going through is big issues of being mocked or ridiculed or humiliated. It could be a certain class or a teacher that just feels like it's out to get you. And why is that going on? I know anxiety is coming for a lot of people over politics, be it locally or nationally. And I know it can also hit the church. And we can wonder, why, God? Why did you allow this to happen locally or the universal church? Think through your daily prayers, your prayer requests, yourself, your family, your friends. Where those are, don't ask for God to be involved. He's involved. Please pray that they see him involved in their life and give him credit. My wife and I have a phrase that we'll use often. It comes from Genesis 50 with Joseph and talking to his brothers. Satan meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. There'll be times where bad things happen in our life. Even for Christians. You give your life to the Lord, it's going to be easy street. I haven't read that part in Scripture yet. I haven't felt that one yet. I haven't experienced that yet. But I know he's in control. He's in complete control and has a plan for everything. I was raised with this mindset of God being in control in our life and being involved. I'm very blessed. When I was going into 9th grade, I had 2 prayer requests every night. I'm opening myself up for you to mock me and then comfort me. The one was to be 6'3.5". I put on the weight for it. I did my part. How's that, okay? Some of you are thinking, well, you should be 7 foot then. But that's a whole other topic, right? Leave me alone. The other one, Val, you'll know this. It's my cousin. We were raised next door to each other. My older sister, at 15 months, her name was Vicky, got encephalitis. Could be a mosquito bite. My older sister medically died at 15 months. She's 2.5 years older than me. She died when she was 58. And so she lived from that point, 15 months, until age 58. No oxygen went to her brain. And so she, again, medically died, but her body, she physically grew. But she could never communicate, couldn't talk to us, couldn't take care of herself. Um, I think it's mentally challenged. We were always told that she was retarded. And I do not mean to offend anyone with that, because that was the word we were used growing up. That's what it was described as. And so maybe it's mentally challenged, whatever. But I prayed every night that she'd be normal. And I remember my mom would say, when I was praying with her on these things, she would say, God has a plan. And she started calling it Vicky's story, because my mom would speak to groups. She used it for counseling, on relating with people. It could be empathy, right? The difference between sympathy and empathy is when you can really relate with someone, you're going through it yourself. And it became her story. My mom would say, you don't need for her to pray for her to be normal, because what? She's going to be going into 11th, 12th grade, but she wouldn't be able to. She'd have to go through kindergarten. She'd have to go through preschool, because it'd be starting all over as a full-grown teen. She goes, but God has a plan. And I know I'll see her in heaven. And then she'd always add, I would rather have a child who's challenged like that I know who's going to heaven, than a son who rebels that I'm not sure about his salvation, right? I was raised with the mindset God's in complete control. I was raised not just when things were going great, but when there are challenges in life. Yeah, I don't know what the future holds, but I know who holds the future. God Almighty. I mentioned I've been going through Psalms in my devotions. Psalm 75:2 jumped out to me this week. God speaking, he said, I choose the appointed time. It is I who judge uprightly. It's God who picks the time. It's God who's involved. It's not this deist mindset that God created everything, sitting back in a lounge chair, drinking some, like an Arnold Palmer or a lemonade or something, and just letting it go on. Let's just see what happens. No, he created everything, but he's involved in keeping everything together. Colossians 1:17, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Moms, you amaze me, by the way. It's fun. We have the moms here today, so thank you for Shannon and Chris's moms are here. But something a mom can do, and maybe some of you dads can, this one didn't, okay? They can walk by a nursery that has 12, 15 kids in it, and one kid's crying and they know if it's theirs. Yeah, the moms are just nodding like, well, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't we be able to know that, right? I want to give you a warning on something here. I've been going through the book of Esther, and just on how God's in control and God's involved. I really believe that's more of a promise for a believer, a follower of Jesus Christ. As a mom hears her child's voice, God hears his child's voice. For those who haven't put their trust in him and are following him, yeah, he's involved in your life, but the goal is for your salvation. He wants to have a relationship with you. He doesn't want anyone to go to hell. And so he will allow things in your life, if you want to say it this way, he'll send things in your life that are uncomfortable so that you would come to him and realize that he has a better plan for your life. And so I say to you, if you haven't given your life to the Lord, let today be the day of salvation. Let today be the day that you realize that I can't do this on my own. I don't want to do this on my own. God, I need you. God, I need you every day. I love that song, by the way. I just need you. Please come into my life and save me. Thank you for Jesus, what he did so I can be saved. And now use me in a mighty way for you, for such a time as this. Shall we pray? Father, we thank you for your word. I thank you for preserving it and also having it translated into our own language so we can study for ourselves. I pray that we'd all take time to be with you, listening to you as you speak through your word, and then conversing with you, talking to you, thanking you, celebrating you, bringing requests to you. I pray for everyone here that somebody who doesn't know you, that today they'd give their life to you. But Father, I also know that there are many here who have given their life to you and they're going through struggles. I pray that they would see you involved in their lives and give you credit, that you would again perform miracles that would draw others to love you and follow you. And I pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.